Welcome to Edge Industry Review Fireside Chat. I'm Jim Davis, editor of Edge Industry Review. Our topic today is deploying network services in a world of ambient distributed computing at the network edge. Today's guest is IBM's GM of Software-Defined Networking, Andrew Coward. Andrew, welcome.
Thanks, Jim. Happy to be on the show.
IBM is still a big company, even after all these years, right? We recently spoke with the head of Edge and Cloud for global communications industry. Why don't you tell us about your role and where your group fits into the picture at IBM and maybe in the market overall?
Yeah, so I joined IBM in January last year, in 2021, to really start a new business unit in IBM to focus IBM or refocus IBM on software networking. Now, arguably, IBM's been out of the networking business for quite a while, but we recognize that networking is changing very radically right now. And so for a company like IBM to kind of sense and recognize the market's changing and go and build and buy technologies to go into that space, we just seemed like it was a perfect time. So I spent my life in networking, various networking vendors, and I've seen a couple of transitions through that time. And of course, the vendors that existed in the 90s aren't necessarily the vendors that exist today. We've seen huge changes, and we really think that the networking industry is going through one of those changes right now. And we see market opportunity to take advantage of that.
Yeah, networking is not really just a big iron and hardware kind of business anymore. It's a software business. And one of the examples that I followed for a number of years is companies like Cloudflare going from startups to now almost $100 billion a year company. You could describe them in a way as a networking company. They also have security services, but all of that being said, it's definitely a different industry now. Maybe you can help me understand what kinds of networking you're talking about. Are we talking about SD-WAN, or what is SDN for you these days?
Right. Well, I think if we start with the problem statement, which is that as enterprises have moved to the cloud, they didn't just move to one cloud, as perhaps we thought they might, 3 or 4 years ago. They moved to many, many clouds. And so there's kind of no limit. You say, well, is 3 clouds enough? No, it's Amazon, it's Azure, it's Google, it's IBM, it's Oracle, and the list goes on, right? And so when you speak to network managers, they'll tell you, we've lost control of the network. We don't know where our traffic goes anymore, and we're not in control of it. And yet it's still our fault when something goes wrong. And so it's not a connectivity issue. And this is what's interesting. It's a policy issue. It's like, how do you manage the traffic that flows in and between the clouds, out to private cloud, out to the edge and the far edge, and bring it coherently into one network that you could control as an enterprise, even though you don't control any of the underlying physical equipment that represents that. So that's the kind of challenge for the industry. And as I say, I think the players that are going into that, there's a lot of startups in that space now, but also a lot of incumbents who are looking at that going, well, if that's the destination, how do we get there and what does that mean?
And so, if I'm not mistaken here, it sounds like you have a strategy of both taking existing assets, building some, but also perhaps acquiring them. What are some of the key areas of product development for you?
Yeah, so we recognize this in 4 buckets of things that we need to do, and we've been on a kind of string of acquisitions that we've done. You'll likely see us do more, and we've been building organically. So those 4 things really are, first of all, orchestration. So how do you give the instructions to the system that says, I want to create a service, I want to link AWS with Azure, with private cloud, or how do I link in a telco space, radio with transport, with edge, with cloud, and pull all those things together. So that's orchestration. Automation, meaning the tool sets that drive the orchestration and also the data collection, things like that. So how do you automate tasks within a framework that sits on top of that orchestration space? Third is analytics. We need data, and we need to understand application information wherever it lives, and understand how the network is performing end to end. There's always that question, is it the application or is it the network? And those are really hard questions to answer now, because when something's distributed across a cloud, the application might be working perfectly well, but one element of it that might do, credit card validation or or some database lookup might be the thing that's broken. And so understanding how applications are tied together, how they're orchestrated, and then how you monitor them once they're running. So that's the third piece. And then fourth is the connectivity. And by that, I don't mean physical connectivity, but how do you kind of string all these things together securely so that you know that only application A is allowed to talk to application B for these kinds of queries and for this type of environment. So we've been on, as I say, a kind of journey to acquire companies. Last year, significantly, we acquired Turbonomic. And as part of that Turbonomic acquisition, we got a product called Sev1. And Sev1 is one of the leading service assurance companies. They're in about 30 of the top 100 banks, about 20 of the top 100 telcos. And they're used to really understand the performance of the network, regardless of where and what the applications are deployed across it or where they're deployed. We also acquired Volta Networks last year, last year, which has given us a distributed routing capability. And so we're kind of taking those products, we're building our own kind of organic development on top of that. Today in the market, we've gone to a pretty large team in a pretty short space of time. So I regard myself really as running a startup within IBM, just a very well-funded startup with great market access. And that's really been the power of saying these are new solutions in a new space, right? I'm not out there to compete with the existing incumbent networking vendors because there's so much open space with all these new technologies and all these new things that have to be addressed.
So we wouldn't really, I don't know how we would characterize the activities. And, some companies like to be in something like a bucket of SD-WAN vendors. Others might say, well, now I'm a secure access service edge vendor or something else. What would you describe your place in the market if you had to use one of those kinds of terms?
Yeah, so I think we're in the orchestration, service assurance, and cloud connectivity and management business. And some of those things are being defined kind of as we speak by the industry. Yeah. But those things have to come together in order for us to manage and control the network infrastructure that's strung across many clouds in many places. And so such a thing doesn't really exist today in any meaningful way, which is why we're building it.
So I'm imagining a IT architect or a network engineer who's got a good grasp of SD-WAN services now and says, well, that's what I'm using to connect my edges. Edges being a branch location of retail stores or something like that. How do you go in and explain to them, okay, well, this is how we see SD-WAN and this is where we fit into the picture. Where is SD-WAN in relation to all these other services as those vendors start to add things like, firewalls at the edge? And how do you describe to this enterprise engineer what you want to help them do?
Right. Well, SD-WAN's a really good example because it's kind of reached mass deployment. Many enterprises have deployed more than one vendor, either through choice or because they've merged together. And it turns out that the workloads and connectivity that you want to get out of that SD-WAN has shifted, right? When SD-WAN started, it was about providing connectivity into the corporate data center. And we had this view of the world where whatever branch was connected to SD-WAN, it would simply move that traffic into some headquarters somewhere. And of course, that's not the way things work today. And it's expected that SD-WAN box connects directly into the different cloud services and lands at a VPC connector into AWS, for example. And it's hard to manage those things. Now, the telcos particularly are having a really hard time with it because their customers are saying to them, well, please, can you provide this connectivity? After all, that's kind of what you do. And there's a very manual process that's involved in configuring the SD-WAN box, configuring the VPC. And it involves asking questions like, Mr. Customer, can you please give me your credentials for AWS? Right, that's crazy. And so our view is that's an orchestrated and service assured managed thing that a telco can offer or an enterprise can do themselves, where we say, here's the things, here are the 2 or 3 things that you need to put into the system, and we will go provision and manage all the underlying elements that get your SD-WAN box connected, regardless of the vendor, into all the VPC connectors, all the clouds that you need, and do that dynamically. Oh, and then after we've done that, we're going to provide the service assurance information generically across the different SD-WAN vendors that you use, so you've got a good understanding of how it's actually operating in real life. So many of our telco customers use the Serve1 product we have to actually demonstrate that their SD-WAN product is working really well to their customers. It becomes a dashboard that says, hey, this is their performance. Now, remember also, SD-WAN was a migration in many cases from MPLS or fixed connectivity. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things, if you're a bank and you're moving to SD-WAN, you're going to be super sensitive about whether or not the SD-WAN solution is going to be as good as MPLS. And of course, there's all security questions to answer. So being able to prove that the SD-WAN service is as good as the old MPLS service is really important for the telcos, and then proving that the traffic only goes to the destinations that it's been designated to it is absolutely required. So that's why we get deployed kind of with Serve1 in telcos to do that, or within large enterprises that want to manage those things themselves. So you can kind of see how it starts to come together in that journey.
Well, so I guess in some ways, I wind up associating SD-WAN a lot with wireline services, using broadband connectivity to replace an MPLS network, or at least supplement it. But I think the use of it has evolved a lot towards things like, backup. We're going to have a blended, network bonding. I might have wireless backhaul. I might also be using something like private 5G, within my facility. So, again, given the interest in private wireless, private 5G networks, where are you going to help out with enterprise needs for that kind of connectivity?
Right. Well, you're absolutely right that there's this kind of really interesting overlap with 5G and fixed 5G access, kind of now treading on the toes, if you like, of the fixed network. It's interesting. I was with one of the CTOs of one of the US telcos in Manhattan, and we stood on the street outside one of the towers, and we're looking at his cell phone, and he's getting 2 gig of throughput on his cell phone. And I'm looking at this going, I didn't even know a phone could go that fast, but this is incredible. But then, of course, the question, why would you put this much capacity into Manhattan? After all, this fixed network works perfectly well. And it comes down to the ubiquity of connectivity and the resiliency of connectivity. So that fixed line, if you wanted to do resiliency in a bank before, you had to dig up the street in 2 different directions into the branch, right? Now you can take the single line you've got, and you can use 5G for multiple directions to provide that resiliency. So then why? So the next question, kind of almost the 5 whys here. So why would a retailer or a bank branch need that level of resiliency? Well, because everything in that bank branch, everything in that retailer or that fast food place has become connected and absolutely required for connectivity. So as a really good example of that, many of the fast food restaurants today actually have a server on premise. They put an x86 server, store it hopefully somewhere out of the way of the grease and everything else that's going on there. And they do that because they want to make sure when you walk into that store, if the network is down, you can still order a burger. Now, here's the problem. Because of COVID, right, we don't just walk into a fast food joint and order food anymore. We order it on an app. And if the app doesn't work because the network's broken, then we go to a different burger joint. So that's kind of inbound network connectivity. Outbound network connectivity, it's really interesting too, because so many of the devices that are on site, let's take the ordering system, where you speak and you order and the computer takes your order and understands that. Well, that has to be network connected all the time. So the requirement for resiliency of network connectivity in retail, in banking, in any kind of edge environment has just gone up massively. So the telcos are recognizing this, and the first thing is you've got to blanket the whole thing with 5G. Private 5G starts to take over where you've got a large industrial environment, for example, or an area where you're not going to have good external 5G connectivity in. There's a really interesting market evolving around the overlap between public and 5G. So as a good example of that, right, when a device ships from a manufacturer, it lands somewhere, it connects to 5G, it has to connect to public 5G first. So which public 5G network is it going to land on? And you don't want to be in a position where you have to type in all the MZs and all the details of that end device to land it on a private 5G network. So there's a really interesting overlap that's going to have to be managed. So we're very early in that world. So to the, what's IBM's role in all this? Well, at the edge, those edge devices, through an open source project called Open Horizon, we're putting technology that enables us to dynamically change the software of that far edge device. Now that's really important because, again, if something's on the internet, you'll need to be able to update it and manage it and control it and decide which cloud it goes to and all those things. So being able to put the infrastructure in place to enable the simplest of devices that can have 5G, that can have software on them, that can connect to the network in multiple ways is a really important attribute. And so IBM's doing that, and we're doing it through open source. So that's kind of one piece of it. And then, of course, you've got the whole orchestration element. So how do you orchestrate across public and private 5G? How do you orchestrate to that edge device and land that thing so it's now connected to its application that happens to live in a cloud somewhere? So all those things are quite complicated events that have to happen. And so having all the piece parts that make that happen is absolutely the journey that we're on here at IBM. Sorry, that was a long answer.
I was going to say, we were having a certain level of complexity, right, just with the wireline networks and managing SD-WAN connections and cloud connections. And then we add in something else we need for resilience, and that adds a whole other level of complexity. Really, I'm sure there's plenty of companies just focusing on that problem alone. So I'm assuming that some of the value of what you're working on at IBM is working across all of these domains to have policy and enforcement and, as you say, data analytics across all of these different modes of communication.
Yeah, that's right. And it really is a policy problem. As I say, we've got the connectivity, that's done. Now it's about how do you have an enterprise be able to come in and fix how that infrastructure, how that network connectivity that is ubiquitous is then used and applied and secured for their world and for their applications, and give them the management tools so they can see it. And so you're creating your own enterprise network over an existing infrastructure to do that, because pretty much nothing in your world you own anymore.
Well, speaking of owning and managing things, companies are again looking at an uncertain economic environment. I think folks went through COVID and came out, fairly well in terms of earnings and all of those kinds of measures. But again, we have economic uncertainty. How are enterprises going to manage resources and invest in these kinds of technologies in this uncertain environment? What's your advice to companies that might be a little hesitant to go out and purchase technology right now?
Well, the thing that we're seeing is that there is still a shortage of workers, still a shortage of people to do things. And so what we're absolutely seeing is the push by enterprises to drive automation. Automation does two things. Of course, it helps with the cost savings that come through that, but it also helps massively in an environment where you can't get the workers for the things that you need to do, right? So those two things, were true during COVID, and they're true coming out of COVID and into whatever it is that we're about to get into, right? So automation is an absolute key element, and so whether it's in telco and taking tasks that take 6 weeks and reducing them to a 20 seconds, 30 seconds kind of operation. And taking people out of that, whether it's an enterprise that can now manage their network without having to go build a global MPLS infrastructure and send people around the world to make that work and manage it on a day-to-day basis. These are all things that save money, they save time, and they save effort. Another good example, taking the servers out of these retail locations, out of banking locations, and putting them into cloud or putting them into edge, means that you don't have to have people going around installing, testing, managing, updating, and supporting this infrastructure. That's expensive and hard. And so for the most part, and for most of the automation projects that we're involved in, the cost-saving elements come out really quickly. And the return on investment is usually less than 12 months. And so for that reason, we don't see a slowdown of companies adopting automation technologies, and networking is really a key part of that.
Interesting. It's good to hear that. Well, that would be about it for today. Andrew, thanks very much for joining us. It's been a really interesting conversation, and look forward to hearing more about how your business develops there.
Thanks, Jim. It's been great talking today.